Okay, so hello everybody. And
hello everyone.
Welcome to Not at the Museum Thursday night. I'm Sylvia. I'm the assistant curator here at the Niagara Falls History Museum. As usual, we're going to begin with our land acknowledgement. So the Niagara region of Ontario is located on the traditional shared territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Chinootan people. The Chinootan people have called this land their home for thousands of years, and more recently, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have shared this land as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. So tonight we continue our Imbibe talk, exploring the history of alcohol, drinks, and drinking. Our speaker this evening is Dan Malleck, a published author and professor in the Department of Health Sciences and the director of Brock's Center of Canadian Studies. He is an internationally recognized expert in drug and alcohol regulation and prohibition. So tonight he's going to be discussing crossing the line, how, when, and where to drink in Niagara after Prohibition. I would just like to remind you there's a Q&A feature on Zoom. So if you have any questions for Dan throughout this presentation, please feel free to write it in there. And at the very end, Dan will answer those questions for you. So I won't take up any more of your time. Let's get this evening started. And I'm just going to hand this over to Dan.
All right, thank you. Let's just see that we have all the tech going. Can you hear me? I'll say that as a yes. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks Sylvia and Christine for inviting me, and Sylvia for managing all of this. It's been a pretty hectic few weeks, I'm sure. Yeah, so as she noted in the introduction, I spend a lot of time thinking about drink, and even professionally. And I've written on liquor licensing, liquor regulation from basically Confederation to the Second World War. What I'm going to focus on here is post-Prohibition drinking in Niagara, but if you had other questions, I might be able to field some of them afterwards. Now I'm going to share my screen. I'm running with two screens today, so if I keep looking back and forth, please don't think I'm just being distracted by the dog or anything like that. Sylvia, just pipe up if you can't see something here, because like I said, it's a little wacky. We're good though?
Sounds good.
Okay, good. Okay, so I want to start today. The paper's called Crossing the Line, How, Where, and When to Drink in Niagara After Prohibition. And I want to start with a story about drinking after Prohibition, not a personal drinking story. In December 1938, a correspondent who signed his name Disgusted wrote to Arnold Smith, the Deputy Chief Commissioner of the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, about what he saw going on at the Bellevue Hotel in Niagara Falls. And we'll see the Bellevue, the modern version of the Bellevue, same place, a little sketchy looking, but it might be a remarkable place. I haven't been in there. I don't want to cast aspersions on the guy or the people who run it. But Disgusted wasn't impressed. He said, "I never saw such rotten carryings on. The place was jammed, drinking in the upstairs bedrooms, people drunk, 3 girls nude carried downstairs with a sheet around them to do their little strip dance in the dining room and in the basement. I never saw so much rot in my life." Now, upon investigation, Wilson Wiley, the LCBO's local inspector, who we will hear a lot from Inspector Wiley in this talk, he found that the allegations, for the most part, were actually true. Often allegations like this are found to be just made up, but apparently a local group of those notorious troublemakers, customs officers, immigrations officers, and post office staff had held a party of some sort that got rapidly out of hand. Now, the nude girls were apparently not so. Rather, they were tap dancers imported from Buffalo to entertain, paraded around covered in a sheet to give the illusion of nudity. But you get the picture. It was a wild party, and it would appear, Wiley reported to the board, that the hotel's proprietor had lost all control over his establishment. Now, I'm starting with this story because I think it illustrates well some of the things I'm going to be talking about here, and it's kind of a funny story too, right? The challenges of running a drinking place in Niagara after Prohibition, with the added complication of the influence of American tourism and interests. And I use the term drinking space intentionally because, as I'll discuss, the terms saloon or tavern or pub were problematic in this period. And I'll talk a little bit about the language of liquor control. in a few minutes. And I should also note that whereas other speakers in this series are investigating drinking as an individual or social activity, the one thing we don't often think about when looking at public drinking, that is drinking alcohol in public places, is that these places are managed by private individuals who are themselves managed by the government agencies. And they're trying to make a living, but they have all these rules and they have to act in a certain way and enforce a certain way of acting on their customers so that they can then not lose their livelihood. So I'll try to show here how some of the reconstruction of public drinking in post-Prohibition Niagara was a process of negotiation. It was negotiation between business owners and their customers, and business owners and government regulators, not so much customers and the regulators, but there was sometimes intersection there. But what the LCBO was doing was regulating the space and the people who ran the space. So there's a lot of interconnected connections of regulation happening at this time. And I'm going to turn off the camera on my video just because I'm going to be looking back and forth between screens and it might be a little confusing to you. So you won't have to see my face for a while. We're still good. You can still see my screen. If I hear nothing about otherwise, then we're good. So now, as I have discussed the development of liquor control at length in a book I published back in, a book UBC Press published in 2012 called Try to Control Yourself. Here's a picture. I really love that picture. And as the title of the book indicates, the idea of liquor control was to impart a degree of self-control on individuals, and not just on the drinkers, but also on the people who are profiting from selling booze. So it was about, and the word try is important too, because often the board would kind of give the benefit of the doubt to people who, I noted, by the way, okay, good, sorry, I wanted to mention that recording thing. Okay, so with that shameless plug over, we'll get on to the rest of my talk. I want to now set the context for the end of Prohibition. We have Prohibition in Ontario from 1916 to 1927. Some argue it ended in 1923 when the government allowed what was called 4.4 beer, which was 2.2% alcohol, so 4.4 proof. But the law that had created Prohibition and most of the rules around Prohibition did not end until 1927 when the Liquor Control Act created the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. And from 1927 to 1934, the board's job was to manage the sales of liquor in store, so the retail sale, and to inspect and sort of keep an eye on the sale of beer and the manufactured sale of beer and wine in the province. More about the sale because manufacture was a federal jurisdiction. So they created the liquor stores. The LCBO stores we have today are sort of the legacy is from back in 1927. And these were highly structured and restricted places. So you would walk in, you had to have a permit, which you bought usually originally, I think it was $1 or so. And it looked like a passport, but it was kind of almost like a ledger book. And this permit would record, the staff would record in this book everything that you purchased. So you think that they're watching you now. And you would go into the store, you would go up to a counter. Some older folks watching will remember this because the process really didn't change except the permit thing until like the 60s and 70s. And you would have a list of all the stuff they sell, and you would write down on a slip of paper what you wanted. You'd hand the clerk your permit, they'd look it over, they look at what you want. If you hadn't been buying too much, or if there weren't any questions about why is this person buying so much? Are they going to resell it? Do they have an illegal place going? Are they just drinking too much? Should we be concerned about this? Then you would get your product. They would shove it in a brown paper bag. You'd pay for it and you'd leave. That's how the original liquor stores were run. Now, nevertheless, even though it was kind of onerous to get your drinks, as you can imagine, people really flooded these stores. And the added feature of 1927 liquor regulation here in Niagara was that Prohibition continued in the States until 1933, the end of 1933. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of interest from folks across the line to come over and buy booze. Now, this was understood. It may have been one of the motivations for creating the Liquor Control Board at this time. D.B. Hanna, the first chief commissioner, said people who come across the line for the purpose of indulging in a blowout will be disappointed. There's this idea of control in the liquor control system. And the law came into effect the 1st of June, 1927. July 1st that year was on a Friday. July 4th, of course, then is on a Monday. And as those of you know, that makes for a boozy long weekend, right? And it was, in fact, a bit of a blowout, notwithstanding what Mr. Hanna had said. Now, the interesting thing about this, don't expect a blowout, is that, in fact, they were very much aware and welcoming of American customers. And in the board's first report to the government, it said, and I pulled this from the report, it was the opinion of the board that Ontario must not be made a beer garden for non-resident groups. At the same time, the board welcomes to Ontario and desires to give service to legitimate tourists and travelers from the United States and elsewhere. So as you can see, there's this tension, right, between we have to control and make sure things aren't going out of control, but also, you know, we need to welcome and encourage, not encourage, but welcome the customers. And in fact, this is one of the things I argue a lot about the LCBO, that it wasn't about prohibition. The liquor control was about allowing liquor, but in certain ways, in certain places, in certain times. Now, today it seems that some of our rules are kind of wacky. I say every province and state has its own type of wacky liquor rules, but people look at the LCBO of 1927 and think, oh, it's just prohibition by government, but it wasn't. It was, in fact, facilitation. It was allowing drinking as long as it was done in a certain way, right? And that's a big difference, because the board's mandate then wasn't to stop it, but it was to permit it, but in different ways. Of course, this liquor control system, this onerous system, encouraged some people. This comic is from an organization called the Moderation League. We don't know a lot about the Moderation League, but I'm pretty sure they were funded by the liquor interests. But they were pushing a view that the liquor industry had been pushing since probably at least the 1870s, which was moderation, or what they called true temperance, which was this idea that, you know, don't go crazy with drinking, but everyone can control their own consumption. The government doesn't have to crack down, doesn't have to prohibit, and those sorts of things. And in this comic, the bootlegger is saying, yeah, well, you know, with all your rules, it's easier for people to go right through Ontario to Quebec than to stay in Ontario, because in Ontario, even visitors had to still buy a permit. I think it was a $2 permit, it says on this cartoon. And you could, in fact, come in and buy booze, but you had to drink it in your home, which was defined in the law, could be a tent or a hotel bedroom, you know. So as long as you had a private controlled space that you were in control of, you could buy booze and drink it. So this bootlegger is saying, you know, thanks a lot for creating this law. It's still going to enrich me. And this was before 1934. So and the Moderation League was really pushing a moderation, a loosening up of the law. So moderate laws to allow drinking, but not, but their rhetoric was about, you know, we're still going to control, we're not going to go crazy about this, right? And yeah, so, and Americans definitely came over. So in June 14th or 15th, the liquor store in Niagara Falls opened up. And the second person to buy was a man from Cleveland, Ohio, who bought a bottle of Old Crow bourbon. I can't remember which of the guys here, I'm sorry for the picture, it's a digital image taken from a microfilm reader. Like I just snapped a picture of the microfilm from the Niagara Falls Review. But I think the guy on the right there is Joseph Powers. He came from Cleveland. I don't know if he came all the way to Niagara just to get his bottle of Old Crow bourbon. Maybe he was here already. Maybe he was coming for the weekend. I don't know. But yeah, so, but that's kind of the interesting connection here on the border, right? Now let's see where we go from here. I have to say that I've been thinking about this a lot, so my talk goes kind of all over the place. And there were many, and the proximity to the border offer, and along with the strict rules, but that hotel bedroom loophole allowed for some considerable illegality. So it's this great picture in the background of the Pickwick or of the Foxhead Inn in Niagara Falls. But Pickwick Inn in Fort Erie, when the inspector showed up, he found that the manager's idea of a hotel seemed to be largely to cater to drinking parties from the US, and in consequence, the place has been allowed to deteriorate. The Foxhead Inn, which was actually considered a fairly respectable inn, downtown Niagara Falls, actually near the falls, the inspector showed up to find bottles of regular strength beer on tables in front of 40 American guests. And there was that kind of sense that when the Americans came over, it got a little worse. And this is also an indication of the expectations people had of what they could do in a bar room. Even before 1934, when when things loosened up a bit, you could sell 4.4 beer, 2.2% beer in a hotel beverage room, but if a proprietor provided stronger stuff, they were breaking the law. And this connects to the expectations of what went on in a drinking space. So music, dancing, gambling, maybe a little bit of sexual impropriety. Those are all part of something a historian, John Berman, called the Vice Constellation, like the way these things, smoking, drinking, swearing, gambling, were all sort of seem to be connected socially. And historian David Courtwright calls this part of limbic capitalism, the sort of activities that tweak our limbic system and that are plugged into our pleasure centers, right? And we'll see how this Vice Constellation plays out in the Niagara experience of post-Prohibition liquor. So 1934, I've mentioned 1934 a few times, was the year that public drinking was finally made legal in Ontario. And by public drinking, I mean drinking in a controlled beverage room space. The law from the beginning was intended to be in the hotel beverage rooms, which is a legacy of pre-Prohibition. By 1916, the only place you could get a drink with your friends was in a hotel beverage room. And soon after the law passed, as they began to implement it, the board decided they're going to sex segregate the beverage room. So the hotels had to have a men's beverage room and a ladies and escorts beverage room. And this may seem a little weird, but they don't mean escorts like escort service escorts. They mean like ladies and a date or ladies and a friend. And the idea here, a lot of historians have looked at this and said, oh yeah, because they didn't want women to just go into the men's beverage room, like prostitutes go into men's beverage room. Again, this Vice Constellation thing. But I found evidence in my research of women writing the LCBO saying, can you create a space for us to drink without all these guys bothering us so much? So there was kind of probably both things were happening, but you can go around Niagara and around Ontario, and you'll see older hotels that will still have ladies and escorts and men's beverage room signs, even if they're like one of the doors doesn't work anymore, things like that. And there were very strict rules on what could go on in these beverage rooms. So the beverage rooms, they did not have a stand-up bar. The stand-up bar would have been blocked by like a cage or something. You were not allowed dancing. You were not allowed gambling by any means, any kind of game playing, music, singing, food. None of this was allowed in the beverage room. As historian Robert Campbell wrote about Vancouver's post-Prohibition rules, you could basically sit down and drink your beer. That was it. You had to be served by a waiter, all of that stuff. The dining rooms had a little more you could do. Of course, you could have a meal. It's a dining room. In fact, you had to have a meal if you were in the hotel dining room. And they could have music and they could get permission to have dancing under certain conditions. And the other thing the LCBO was very strict about was that drink revenue could not be the main revenue source of a hotel. So if a hotel owner said, look, I need to have this license because my hotel business isn't going well and this will help, the board was more likely to say, sorry, that's not good enough. You have to have a functioning accommodation business, and the beverage room has to be sort of a secondary aspect of it. And again, the idea of the board was to create legal drinking in legal spaces and to make it nice enough that people would stop going to those illegal spaces, like we call speakeasies, or you've heard of those sort of things through Prohibition, but not so liberal that things the Vice Constellation that reappears in these places, right? So there's not going to be dancing and carousing and gambling. In fact, the board could, the inspector might walk by a beverage room and hear singing inside, and he'd go in and he'd say to the manager, "You've got to stop this." He wouldn't go in himself and wag his finger around. He would just say to the manager, you know, "Get on this." And this also led to this idea of the respectable drinking space through language. And historians talk about, and other scholars talk about, sort of discursive systems. Sorry, I've just got to find my, my notes again. And so reshaping drinking behavior involved reshaping the way people thought about proper drinking. This is what we call a discursive project, because it's not only about what you did, but how you talked about it and how you thought about it. So there were certain words that were not permitted. So for example, it was a beverage room, right? It was not a pub or a saloon or a tavern or a tap room. Although there are interesting exceptions that sort of probe the rule. The phrase "exception proves the rule" is wrong. It's exceptions probe the rule, because we look at the Foxhead Inn again, which, even though there were 40 bottles of beer on the tables to cater to the Americans, later, well, Howard Fox was a fairly respectable businessman, and he tended to run his place well. So in 1941, he approached the board and said, "I'd like to put the sign, a tavern sign, outside of my hotel." You can see it. I've got the little yellow arrow pointing to the sign. This is a picture from a postcard in the 40s. And he said, "As you know, our hotel is in the Old English Inn type, and tavern will be very much in keeping with the old country appearance." Now, when I first read this letter in the LCBO records, I went, well, they're not going to say yes to that. But they did, right? Which surprised the heck out of me. And in fact, they said, "Have the sign in keeping with the old country inn appearance of your hotel, and you'll be fine," right? And that made me stop and think about, what are they really regulating? And they're looking at the respectable comportment, the behavior of the proprietor, right? So they had faith that he could manage a good hotel. So he got these little extra permissions, although down the road, there were people who were putting up similar signs, and the board was saying, "Yeah, you take that down." But beyond the language was all of these rules and laws that the proprietors needed to work around. And so there are two ways that they could entice clientele that was looked down upon by the board. The first were law violations, and the second were rule violations. So law violation would be actually something that violated the law of the land. I think you can understand this. And rule violations were violations that were violating the regulations that the board created, and that would be sort of conditions of having a license to sell booze. And a lot of times, as with Howard Fox's request about the tavern sign, the inspectors were constantly assessing the character and the capability of the manager. And a lot of times, whether they got permission or not, or the degree of the penalty they had imposed upon them, depended upon the assessment of the capability of the proprietor themselves. So a few examples of law violations. The New Murray Hotel downtown St. Catharines, which was on the corner of James Street and King Street. If you know that corner now, I think it was replaced with a building that now has a Works burger place in the main floor. It was generally a fairly respectable place back then, but the inspector found things like gambling, a so-called racetrack book, loose women, aka prostitutes, Sunday booze sales, which was illegal, illegal liquor sales, so spirits, all of these things happening. And most of these were violations of the law. And as you can see, they're all parts of the Vice Constellation, right? The gambling, the prostitution, they were probably swearing when they lost the races and stuff like that. Down in Port Colborne, the Belmont Hotel, which is now the Belmont Tavern, same building, they were found to be serving cocktails, and there was prostitution, and there was gambling, and there was after-hour drinking again. So you see the same sorts of things that people were doing to try to build and reinforce, build and reinforce their clientele base. By the way, a lot of the pictures in the background here come from the wonderful digital collection of the the Niagara Museum and the Niagara sorry, the Niagara Falls Museum, Niagara Falls Library, and St. Catherine's Museum. Some great stuff up there. I wish I knew about that when I was putting up my book. Along with law violations, there's rule violations. So that liquor in the bedroom rule, you were allowed to have your own liquor in the bedroom, led to all sorts of opportunities for proprietors to kind of massage the law, right? So inspectors would find beer in the icebox of the hotel kitchen, and they say, whose beer is this? And the proprietor might say, oh yeah, it's just one of my staff, right? He's going to take it home after, which is not allowed, by the way, but it wasn't as bad as saying, yeah, I'm keeping beer on ice for my customers upstairs, which meant, were you serving your customers that beer? You know, those sorts of questions. Spirits could not be in the hotel except in except in bedrooms. If you bought your own spirits and brought it in, like your bottle of Old Crow bourbon. But the hotel proprietors could have their own private rooms and they could have booze in there. And so it wasn't much of a leap for some hotel proprietors to say, well, you know, you want a drink? I've got some here. I'll just bring it up to you, which was illegal, right? Which was a rule violation. It wasn't, I think it may have been illegal. So this may be rule violation and law violation. My favorite story of a rule violation was the manager of the King Edward Hotel, seen here in the background. He asked the board if he could have rooms designated a bedroom or a dining room or a banquet room as occasion required. And the Inspector Wiley, when he reported to the board, he said, yeah, this guy basically wants to be able to have someone come in and rent a banquet room, call it his bedroom, bring in his own booze, and then serve it to a whole bunch of his friends or customers or whatever, right? So he saw right through that, and he was not allowed to see it. And if you're curious, here's a picture of the lounge in the King Edward Hotel, and you can imagine someone renting this and then having a party, right? Which, that's not really within the rules. There were also many incentives to stay and drink. The Tourist Inn in Fort Erie was found to have ducks, geese, and turkeys they were offering as prizes for raffles or other games of chance. Not allowed, because you're enticing people to come and drink and you're luring them in with other things. Many hotels had slot machines across the province, and some municipalities allowed them, but the board did not allow slot machines. The Dane City Hotel outside of Welland had a brilliant plan. What they did was they just didn't change the clocks. So they remain, I think they stayed on daylight savings time all year. So when the adjacent municipalities turned their clocks back or forward, I'm always mixed up on that. When it hit midnight, when you were supposed to close in Welland or Niagara Falls, Dane City was still at 11 o'clock, right? So people could still come there for another hour and technically legally drink. And the board just said, no, guess what? You're on the same time zone as everyone else. The new Statler Hotel, which is pictured here, which was across from the New Murray Hotel on James and King, it's gone as well. It's now at Tim Hortons. They offered premiums on gas. So you could buy beer in the beverage room and you get a coupon or something to sell, to buy cheaper gas up the road at a gas station. And the Bonvilla Hotel, which there was a very clever and innovative hotel proprietor there. One week he brought in a fortune teller, Madame Bindis, who was gonna tell fortunes in the beverage room, or I think she was doing this in the dining room. The next week there was a tap dancing show. There's a lot of stuff going on in the Bonvilla, and the board would just say, look, you got to stop doing that because that's beyond what we're permitting and beyond what you should be doing. But the biggest incentive came through music and especially dancing. Now remember, in the dining room, people were allowed to listen to music. The proprietors could run a music box or have a band if they got permission. So the Maple Leaf Hotel proprietor said, look, the public seem to want to go where they can get a little more than a drink. They want to go where they can get a little enjoyment. I mean, they want music, right? So this connection between music, sitting and listening to, imagine going to a bar, or even just a quiet pub and not having anything. Now, some people love that, but no music, no radio, no TV, no nothing. Was weird to people then, and it would be here. And there are all sorts of opportunities and problems found. The Trenick Hotel in Niagara Falls, which is sort of the fuzzy picture in the background there, the inspector found a piano in the ladies and escorts beverage room, but the manager said, well, that's not for when there's people drinking here. We have a tap dance class come in, and the piano is for the tap dance class, which may have been the case. It's hard to tell, but having a piano in the beverage room itself wasn't a problem, but it was an enticement. Imagine you have a piano, people are sitting around, and someone says, hey, you want to hear the song? And then suddenly there's a song, a sing-along going on, which they did find happen. My favorite story of music is the way the inspector described what was going on at the Hotel Grimsby. And he goes, he showed up one evening to see a three-piece orchestra discoursing third-rate jazz music in the front window of the hotel. And he said the obvious reason for the innovation would be to direct all and sundry that there was in the village a real live tavern. So this band in the window, drawing people in, come and party with us, just exceeded the idea of proper, respectable, responsible place to drink, even though most people were probably really happy, except for the neighbors who didn't want the third-rate jazz, I'm sure. So the biggest thing then was this dinner dance, what I call the dinner dance loophole. And I apologize, the picture here is of a dance hall at the Edgewater Hotel in Essex County down in Riverside. I couldn't find a picture from my records of a hotel dining room that was set up for dancing here in Niagara, but it gives you a sense of a fairly well run. This is a bit of a party place as well, and this dinner dance loophole, I'll go back for a second, had a lot of restrictions on it. So the board had to give permission to run a dance. Your customers had to buy a certain amount of price-wise of food, so like $1 or something like that. They had to have a table. They couldn't just wander around, and they could dance and that sort of thing. So the idea of a nice genteel dance and dinner was the ideal. But many people tried to get around that. And there's all sorts of, and then the board went and assessed the space and assessed the management to see if, in fact, they were going to permit this. And so the inspector went into the Mather Arms in Fort Erie and said, whilst the room is of a size which would lend itself to banquets and accompanying dances, the proposal to conduct 1 or 2 dances per week as per request would undoubtedly introduce conduct which the board would ultimately censure. So he basically said, this manager is not cut out for running this kind of activity. But if you look at the Bond Villa Hotel in Niagara Falls, which was considerably smaller than the Mather Arms, the inspector said, yeah, it's a small place, but it's carefully managed and is patronized by a good type of customer. So you see sort of a assessment of the character of the management, the question about whether this place is going to cause problems, and whether it's going to be something that the board is going to have to deal with later. And I should note as well, remember that one of the post-prohibition challenges the LCBO faced was that there were still a lot of people who wanted prohibition. So the board was trying to facilitate drinking, but also was careful to avoid situations where the temperance people would say, see, we told you this was going to be a problem, and we need to shut these places down. So they were kind of managing the optics of drinking as well. And that gets back to those pesky Americans, right? In 1935, Inspector Wiley was at the Embassy Hotel in Port Dalhousie, and he wrote in his report that he was concerned that the hotel proprietor was offering dancing in the dark, in a darkened room. He said any number of moral dangers could occur in that darkness. The proprietor could not adequately oversee the activities of his hotel guests, and this darkened dance hall, he wrote, is an innovation from across the river. And this idea that there's this kind of contagion, pardon the language, in the era of COVID, coming across the border that would somehow corrupt the people of Niagara. This was threaded through a lot of the language of liquor control. So as you see in these quotes here in the Mather Arms, again, when it applied for dine and dance permission, Wiley wrote, my experience of the conduct of over the river guests has been that they have little disposition to observe the regulations of the Liquor Control Act. And again, they didn't really have confidence in the proprietor's ability to manage those folks. And then, so for example, in Crystal Beach, we have the picture in the background of Crystal Beach. Wiley wrote to the board saying, hey, don't forget, basically he said, don't forget to send a reminder to the proprietors of hotels in Crystal Beach about our rules, because he said, in view of the American atmosphere that prevails at Crystal Beach and the possibilities of temptation to law infractions. So you see this kind of this fear and concern about the influence of America. Now, this is post US prohibition ending, so there was an awareness of what was happening in a much less strictly controlled liquor environment across the river. And in fact, that was something that was of concern to, that threaded through some of the language in the Liquor Control Board's correspondence. And so the manager of the Venetian hotel justified his need for dancing in his hotel. And if you can tell in the background there, this place wasn't very big. Saying, the younger generation, our clientele is of the younger generation, and if they cannot indulge in dancing while partaking of their meals, they will go to the American side and patronize hotels there. And he wasn't just making an economic argument saying, look, we want those customers, we don't want them to go over there. He was also making a moral argument. He was making an argument about what could happen to impressionable youth if they kept going across the river instead of staying here. And this again is something that we see a lot in the Windsor-Essex area as well, where Windsor, Detroit, with a big concern about young people heading over to the US, and the sense of them being corrupted by what was going on over there. So I'm just going to summarize. I mean, there are lots of stories and sort of threads of what I'm trying to argue here, is that to understand liquor control in post-prohibition Ontario, I say before and into the Second World War, we need to understand that the LCBO's job was to reconstruct and to construct a new type of drinking space and a new understanding of drinking and of responsible drinking. So to do that, they had to both mute the voices of the temperance movement by creating a system where the excesses of pre-prohibition drinking, even the illusions of excesses, because a lot of pre-prohibition drinking wasn't necessarily as bad as the temperance movement argued, those illusions were not, the specters were not reemerging. And at the same time, facilitating drinking by removing the worst excesses, but allowing it. It was about permitting drinking, but it was about permitting it under certain conditions in certain ways, right? And to do this, the proprietors and the customers had to demonstrate and exercise a certain degree of control, right? And that was one of the challenges with Americans, is the sense that they're not like us, right? They're not following our rules, they're Americans, right? And it was, I don't know if it was anti-Americanism, if it was fear of the wealth that they saw of Americans. There was some language in some of the stuff I've read about, bringing all their money over here and spending it here, and they'll spend it as they want. But there was this thread of our people are more respectable, and it's our job to protect them, not the Americans. But at the same time, people wanted to socialize. They wanted to drink, and they wanted to hang out with their friends and meet people, right? So, and they expected entertainment, and they expected connection to other activities. And places like Fort Erie were challenged because Crystal Beach did have huge dance, I think had the biggest dance pavilion in North America. So there was a lot of dancing, and of course it was completely dry. No one would ever bring a flask or anything like that to a dance pavilion. There was a need to kind of negotiate the expectations of customers and how to provide this type of experience that would discourage people from going back to illegal drinking behavior. So as I say in the second last point here, it was about negotiation, and that negotiation involved assessing the character of the proprietor, assessing this character of the space, the layout of the space, and for the board to sort of determine if this individual or this hotel or these staff were able to enforce this idea of respectable, responsible drinking in a way that would avoid a return to prohibition that might come through a return to these sorts of connections to that Vice Constellation and the negative activities and the illusions of the pre-prohibition saloon that still existed. and it was in the end, as I say, my final point here is that they needed to make the legal drinking system work. And there were a lot of factors that they needed to consider in that. So I'm going to try to open my, there's me again, and I'll stop sharing my thing. And I'm done. Thank you. So,
okay, thank you,
there
Dan.
you are.
I do have a question for you, if that's okay.
Mhm.
I wanted to know if you could tell me how widespread was like dry areas, dry states, dry cities. Like, do you know particularly how many stayed dry after the end of Prohibition?
I don't know off the top of my head how many did. By what happened was, and when you're talking about dry communities, the liquor control, sort of the Liquor Licensing Act prior to Prohibition, and actually there was a law called the Canada Temperance Act, allowed municipalities to vote themselves dry. So it's notorious that Font Hill was once Temperanceville, right? Thorold was also dry. I think Niagara on the Lake was dry for a while. I'm not sure if, I know that when Prohibition ended, those pre-Prohibition decisions were reinstated, but I don't know if they needed to, how many of them then voted themselves wet, right? I know that the community I grew up in for part of my, well, for my teenage years was a township in southwestern Ontario. It was dry until 1984. And I was like, what? You can't, but why? What's this all about? So yeah, so there are pockets of them all over. A lot of them in southwestern Ontario, almost all of them were in some ways rural, so not, there were no cities that were dry, although I mentioned there were a few towns. And sometimes this dryness it was like a 3-year window that you had to, the law had to be in place before you could try to revoke it. So it sometimes was a bit of a process to have it repealed, but I don't know specific numbers of that.
Okay, we're just trying to see here. Oh, there seem to be a couple questions. So Jesse from last week is wondering, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the LCBO. Oh goodness.
The interdiction list. Yeah.
Sorry.
I can talk a bit about it. I don't know nearly as much as some other people who have written on it. So this is something that was also not exactly most diplomatically called the Indian list. And this was a list of people who were banned from drinking, from buying booze. And so the board would assess, sometimes they would get, usually what would happen is, and this actually was the case prior to Prohibition, but I don't know if it had the same name. Family members could write to the board or to the inspector before Prohibition and say, can you put my husband, son, wife, maybe, I didn't see any examples of wives, on the list, right? So that they were not allowed to buy liquor. And it was usually because there was a problem, right? And it had the name it had because at the time Indigenous people were not allowed to, I think, buy liquor, and there were some concerns. There was, what we would call racist concerns about that, right? But it was, yeah. So, and that's where it got its name. But it was a form of the board, sort of usually acting on behalf of family members to put their to stop their family members from drinking or from buying booze, not from drinking. They couldn't necessarily control that. Usually it was the police that would have to intervene at that point. I know that's not a really full answer, but I don't know what else you were looking for, Jesse.
And then we have one more from Rico.
Hi, Rico.
Great stuff, Dan. Prohibition, was there an equivalent to the LCBO in New York?
Yeah, yes, there was. It wasn't as strict. A colleague of mine who's now passed on, Bill Rorabaugh, who lived in Seattle, told me at one point that every state along the border with Canada had a more strict liquor control regime than the states further south. But I don't know any of the details about the liquor board in New York at the time. So I can't give you more than that. Although I can say that it was not as restrictive after when Prohibition ended in the US, we've seen the stories, whether it's fictitious or otherwise, and it was much more liberal in the things you could do in beverage rooms or bars or nightclubs and things like that than here in Canada. But I don't know anything more than that.
Okay, we have a question actually that's coming through Facebook.
Yeah.
So this person came in a little bit late, so they apologize,
Okay.
but they wanted to know the image behind you, if you can explain what that is.
Oh yeah, that is the men's beverage room of the new Statler Hotel, which used to be, well, as I mentioned it earlier, it was on the corner of James and King Street in St. Catharines. It's one of, I wish I could, I have a bunch of these pictures. I'm trying to figure out the layout because I think the men's beverage room, it sort of was a U shape. So the men's beverage room, and then behind, I'll see if I can get it out of the way, you can see there, that's the tap room. And so the tap man was kind of like the main eyes in the business. And he would, so the waiters would go in there and they'd bring the drinks out. And behind him, and I wish I could pull it up quickly, but I can't. Let me see if I actually still have the slide here. Behind the tap man was actually the ladies and escorts beverage room. And it would kind of loop, it would go that way, and then up the other side was the dining room. So it was, imagine a U around like the central staircase, and I think there was an office and bathrooms in there. So this is the men's beverage room, and this was a picture submitted by the proprietor of the new Statler to the LCBO. Everyone had to send pictures in, and the LCBO management will look at it, and then they might send an architect out to help to rearrange the space. So usually these had no pictures, or sorry, had no people in them. But if I don't know if you can see this. I'm going to share my screen very briefly because I'm going to show the cover of my book. If you see down here, I don't know how well you can see it, and I don't know if I can zoom in. This is from a beverage room in Port Arthur, Ontario, and there's a guy there, right? And the reason I had them put this on the cover of the book because it was a rare picture of that had a person in it. It was like, there's actually a drinker there. And I could just imagine this guy's like, I'm not getting out of the way, I'm having my beer. So that's the extended, so you ask me a question, you get 3 answers, right? But that's sort of the extended answer. So that's the new Statler. And I have asked on Facebook and other places if people have any images of the place, because I'm trying to figure out the layout of it. Because at one point the new Statler got permission to have dancing in the dining room. And the dining room was the same size as this beverage room. I can't imagine dancing and dining in a space that small, but
okay, so we have another question from John. Can you talk a bit about the moratorium on granting winery licenses?
Oh, John, yeah, I could, because I wrote something on this a while ago, but it's been so long. Yeah, so the board, I'm going to give you a really flimsy answer. So when the board licensed wineries, and then at some point, I think it was in the 30s, they said, we're not licensing anymore. So basically wineries, because wineries were never, manufacturing of booze was not illegal during Prohibition, except for a brief time during the war. And wine, and domestic wine was controlled, but never restricted as far as I understand, but it was limited. So at the end of Prohibition, the wineries in existence got licensed by the board, and then it added a few over the next few years, and then they just put a line under that. They said no more. And what happened was, saw a lot of consolidation of wineries. So smaller wineries or really bad wineries will get bought up by the bigger wineries, just so they had that license so that they could open another store, because every winery could have one store. Usually it was a store on site, but it didn't have to be. So then you find some of the bigger wineries would buy up, like a few places in Essex and a few places around Toronto, there were wineries. And then they would open a store in Toronto and open a store in Ottawa and open a store in Niagara, things like that. So that's all I can say about it right now, because I can't remember the rest of it. But yeah, that's all I got for you.
Okay, and we have another question from Rico. Can you tell us anything about the beverage history of the Welland Hotel?
Yeah. When I was preparing this, I was thinking about how that building, I would walk past it and I'd say, okay, so that's where the men's beverage room was, unless that was the ladies and escorts, right? And so all I can say is that physically from the outside, you could see where they added a beverage room to deal with the rules of the Liquor Control Board. It was a well-respected place at the time, so there weren't a lot of records. What the interesting thing about this research, there's 10,000 files of establishments in the Liquor Control Board records in the Archives of Ontario. And when they bring out a banker's box, I would go through it, and I always knew I was going to be disappointed and happy at the same time when I pulled out a thin file. Disappointed because there wasn't a lot of good stuff for my research, but happy because I didn't have to read a lot of stuff to find the good stuff. And the Welland Hotel had a fairly thin file because there wasn't a lot going on. And my research, the nature of my research is such that it's just stuff goes under the radar unless someone's writing a lot about it, right? And if there's no one writing about the crazy stuff that's going on in the hotel, I don't see it. So that's the extent of what I can say. It's that they were well respected. It still was sort of a destination, downtown St. Catharines. They did have to modify things to deal with the board's rules, but because they were respectable, there wasn't a great paper trail in the Liquor Control Board records. Sorry.
Okay, I don't see any more questions coming up. I'm just going to check the chat quickly. We're good. So thank you very much, Dan, for taking the time and enlightening us tonight on the history. I think everyone really enjoyed it. Lots of questions coming through. So thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thanks everyone for coming and for the questions. It's great.
Excellent. And for everybody else, we do have 2 more live on digital talks that we're doing next month. September 9th and 16th, we have Voices Lost in Crisis. So everyone is welcome to join. And I just see that we have a little chat here. Oh, someone just saying thank you. What a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you again. And if you can join us for any more of our live talks, everything is listed on social media. So if you have Facebook, Instagram, we're all over there. So please check in with us. We're online. So if you're interested in anything, and we are going live with our Thursday nights in September. So be on the lookout for that as well. So I just want to thank you, Dan, again for joining us tonight. And thank you all for tuning in, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.